Lieutenant Kirsten Buckles was positively giddy with excitement. This was her first time leading a mission outside of the wire in a combat zone. A big day for any first lieutenant. Yesterday's mission had been the last mission of the left seat, right seat changeover with the unit they were relieving. Yesterday, she had the experience of the convoy commander she had been relieving to fall back on, if she needed some help, of course. Today, it was just her running the convoy. 10 up-armored trucks out in Indian country, hauling supplies to the guys who operated out in the middle of nowhere, FOBs and camps. She felt a bit like Santa Claus. If Santa was hauling belts of 7.62 Rippets, MREs, and mail from across the United States and some points abroad. She couldn't wait to call her father from the call center after they got back from the lodge run. It would be a day worth sharing with the old man. He was so proud of her and her military career so far. Although the old man's pride in her felt like added pressure most of the time, she was still able to draw pride in the fact that he believed in her so wholeheartedly. Yes, today would be a day worth sharing with him. She only had to get through it first. Her Blue Force tracker, a battle space control computer that was mounted in every single command vehicle, was showing the progress of her convoy. Her pre-planned route was taking her through a little nameless village that she couldn't for the life of her begin to pronounce. A previous unit that had operated in the region had left a digital sticky note on the location, which simply said, "Local allegiance shaky. Try not to do anything to piss them off." That didn't sound like a lot, but those 12 words placed a little more pressure on Lieutenant Buckles. She was the tip of American diplomacy in the area. She would have to do her level best to contribute to building the goodwill of the people in the region. She and her soldiers would be seen as invaders by the townspeople. No matter that she was just moving through the town with no hostile designs towards anyone. Heck, she thought to herself. I wish they understood what we were trying to do here. If I could, I'd put my soldiers on the deck and start rebuilding this road. I bet that would show them we weren't here to be enemies. The road was a torn-up little 2-lane path that at one point could have been considered a decent attempt at road building, but years of degradation and lack of proper National Highway Department had rendered it little more than one giant pothole. Prime real estate for those who emplaced improvised explosive devices. With the road in such crap shape, it was easy to miss the telltale signs of an emplaced IED. Freshly turned gravel, shovel marks, new holes, or any other giveaway that would be as clear as sunshine on any other road, but just disappeared into the broken-up gravel and sand of this glorified goat path. Buckles was willing to bet that they could win the will of the people if they just deployed engineers to build them a new road. But she doubted anyone would pay attention to her idle thoughts, and she was just a lowly first lieutenant and wasn't in charge of the army. Yet, she mumbled out loud, a small smile positively beaming at the positive prospects played out across her face. "You say something, ma'am?" Specialist Max Garcia, the driver of her Matvi, asked her. "Oh, nothing, Specialist Garcia," she said. "Just dream about when I get to be Chief of Staff of the Army." "Oh, fucking right on, ma'am," Garcia responded in the laid-back way that seemed to be his way about everything. "I'll be able to say I knew her back before she was famous. That'll be fucking cool." "No, heck yeah," Buckles shot back, her infectious positivity soaked into every word. "I'll make sure you're Sergeant Major, too," she said with a conspiratorial whisper, putting her finger against the side of her nose. "Course, that is, if you haven't made it to the E9 on your own by then." "Well, crap, boss. Hook it up with Sergeant Major of the Army." Buckles chuckled at that. One of her best qualities as a leader was her faith that her soldiers could do anything. She had only had one actual problem child under her command to challenge that theory. A problem child who she had been able to help turn around, mostly through her encouraging and positive nature. Buckles wasn't the sort of leader who took credit for that sort of thing, though. It didn't hurt that her more motivated specialists were administering a couple of wall-to-wall counseling sessions, but that was unbeknownst to her. As far as she knew, a good soldier had been living inside that messed-up individual. She had just coaxed it out into the light with the right combination of faith and positivity. "Well, I can't just give you everything, Garcia," she told him over the intercom. "Besides, I'll have you know that I truly believe you have the ability to earn that on your own." "Oh, thanks, Mom. I mean, ma'am," Garcia said with a chuckle, which pulled a genuine laugh out of the young lieutenant from Red Wing, Minnesota. Garcia was a well-seasoned specialist and a veteran member of the E4 Mafia, a soldier well-versed in the power of the sham shield, but even he was infected by Buckles' positivity. He would never mention this out loud in the presence of his fellow E4s, but he was even thinking about re-enlisting.
All Vix, this is Grizzly 1-1.
The vehicle commander of the lead truck in the convoy's voice came over the net.
Be advised we have a car stopped on the right side of the road about 200 meters in front of us. Driver looks pretty interested in us.
Grizzly 1-1, Minnesota copies all. Buckles keyed out using her call sign. What is it looking like he's doing?
Looks like he's observing us,
the lead truck responded.
His hood is popped and he's hanging out in the driver's seat, but the car is angled so that he can still watch down the road, which is what he seems to be doing.
Can you be certain he's just watching us and not waiting for a ride?
It's possible, ma'am.
Grizzly 1-1 came back over the radio.
Something feels off about it. Call it a gut feeling.
Okay, Kirsten, Buckles thought to herself. Intelligence says that there isn't much in the way of enemy activity in this AO. It's most likely just a guy in a broken-down car. Nothing to get too worried about. This is a third-world country and cars break down all the time. No need to freak out and let imaginary enemies dictate our course of action. Most likely just a broken-down old Russian car that nobody gets parts for. Copy that, 1-1, Buckles replied. I trust your gut, but we still have a mission to complete. Give him a wide berth and we'll keep eyes on him. That's about all we can do. We could snap on him, but we do have a timeline we have to stick to. How copy?
Grizzly Actual, 1-1 copies all. We'll keep eyes on him. Out.
He's probably just some guy stuck on the side of the road. Buckles attempted to reassure her convoy. But if he isn't, we're all in up-armored trucks and we have machine guns in all of them. We know how they use them too.
Hooah!
1-1 shot back over the radio. Buckles leaned back in her seat. She hoped she was making the right call. As much as she had been trying to reassure her soldiers, she was needing reassuring herself. Her father had always told her not to second-guess her command decisions and be ready to back them up with violent force if necessary. Easy to say, harder to do though. It wasn't long before the first truck in the convoy swung wide to give the car on the side a wide berth. The trucks played follow the leader and swung wide as well. Kirsten's truck eventually reached the car, and she got her first close-up look at the man in the car. The car itself was pretty normal for the area, a well-used old French sedan, painted in the color of an old battleship. Just as the commander of the lead truck had said, the vehicle's sole occupant, a military-aged male sitting in the driver's seat of the old Renault, was making no attempt at hiding the fact that he was observing the convoy. I mean, at this point he was right next to it, so he couldn't ignore it if he tried. Was he watching out of curiosity, or something else? Buckles had a brief second to get a look at the man himself. He looked like a local. If not to the town, then at least the country. Buckles managed to make eye contact with the man through the closed window of both vehicles. If the eyes were the portal to the soul, this man was made up of pure hate. Buckles suddenly felt a ball of anxiety start to spin in her gut. Not every local loved the American army, and this man seemed to be the personification of that fact. She knew that per standard operating procedure, there wasn't a whole lot she could justify doing in response to a mean look. If the entire US military stopped a convoy every time they got a nasty look, nothing would ever get done in this country. This guy, though? This guy made Buckles nervous as all hell, and she didn't have a whole lot of options, but she would do what she could do.
All Grizzly Vicks, this is Minnesota. Keep an eye on that car. We got one military-age male occupant, and he doesn't seem to be all biggers than Myra. So, let's stay nimble here. Let me know if he does anything odd. Out. This might get fucked, Darcia,
Buckles said to her driver, nerves starting to perk up in her voice.
Keep your eyes open. Hey fucking open, ma'am,
the Texas native girl said, using the Midwestern term the entire platoon had picked up after she took command, a sort of sign of respect for the young officer.
Hey, Ski, keep that gun scanning, bro. Boss lady's getting a weird feeling.
The tall, quiet soldier sitting in the back seat, manning the automated crow's turret control station, merely grunted in response. He wasn't much of a talker, but Buckles trusted him despite his standoffish nature. He was a solid soldier. The young officer forced herself to take in a deep breath. She had a lot of firepower and a lot of solid soldiers backing her up. The 10 trucks entered the dusty little village without incident. Kirsten watched as the guns on the trucks behind her and ahead of her swung back and forth, covering their sectors of fire. The soldiers either in the turrets or manning the crow stations all seemed to be doing their best to stay right on the ball. There was tension in the air, but the locals didn't seem to pay them much mind as they rolled through, which was more than fine with Kirsten. They wanted to pretend that Grizzly didn't exist. That was just fine with her. Although she did wave at many of the locals who would spare a glance her way. She was still from a small town, and that's how things were done. If you saw somebody, you waved, even if you didn't have a clue who they were. Sometimes she got a wave back, which was nice. The rear vehicle of the convoy was about a mile outside of the little village when Kirsten turned to Garcia and said,
"Well, I think we made it through that okay. Good job, us."
Garcia raised the rippet in his non-steering hand and toast.
"Cheers, ma'am. I'll drink to that."
Kirsten raised her own rippet in return and took a sip. The warm energy drink tasted like stale cherry-flavored battery acid, but she savored it. It was that none-too-ironic point that the convoy came to a halt. Kirsten was hesitant to get out, but she knew her place was on the ground while her soldiers were out in their trucks and on deck. She took a deep breath and exhaled, whispering, "It's only a blown tire, Kirsten. Don't freak out," she whispered to herself as she put her shoulder into the armored door, shoving it open. As soon as she was out in the open daylight, the world got louder, as she was no longer surrounded by the sound-dampening interior of the armored Matvey. She looked down at her combat boots, standing on unsecured territory for the first time. Everywhere else she had been in this country, she had been behind HESCO barriers and concertina wire. But right now, she was outside the wire, so this was kind of a big moment. Buckles looked up the row of trucks to the lead truck before turning back to look at the gun truck bringing up the rear of the convoy, as if to make sure that nobody had run off with one of her vehicles. "All there," she said out loud to herself. "It's okay. Just a blown tire. Nobody's gonna steal one of my rigs. Not that they could, because, the guns and stuff." Kirsten shook her head. "Girl, you are talking to yourself. Calm down." She turned and walked down towards the truck in need of a new shoe. Her soldiers were working quick to get the tire changed. They had already gotten it off. The tires on these trucks were supposed to be run flats, but this one was mangled. Like it went 6 rounds with a cranky hippopotamus. Sergeant Jimenez was wrenching the lugs on the new wheel down, the PFCs who had wrestled it into place standing by him. He turned to one and said,
All right, mijo. She'll be good to go.
He backed up and yelled across the truck to the soldier behind the wheel.
All right, roll the truck around about 5 feet,
Jimenez yelled at the driver.
Let's make sure this bitch isn't about to fall off when we start moving.
Buckles thought that was kind of an odd spot to check. The tire was bolted on. It wasn't going anywhere. Sergeant Jimenez was an NCO, though, and she wasn't going to make him look bad by questioning one of his orders in front of the Joes, especially not over something as trivial as an extra spot check on a piece of equipment. At the end of the day, it was just due diligence, not something an NCO could or should be faulted for. The driver of the truck put it in gear, and the truck slowly rolled off. Something in the dirt, about a foot in front of the truck, drew Buckles' attention. Something about this particular bit of ground looked off to her. The ground was flatter than any patch of old road through a backwater village had any right to be. Buckles' brow furrowed as she tried to figure out what about it drew her gaze. It almost looked like someone had packed the ground down. Why would someone pack that one spot in the road down? It took Kirsten Buckles about a nanosecond to connect the dots on that mystery. Her eyes went wide, just as the front tire of the up-armored truck rolled over that flattened patch of dirt. She reached forward to grab Jimenez's shoulders and move him out of the way.
Stop!
Buckles managed to cry out as she shoved Jimenez down, jumping on top of him since he was the closest to the truck, trying to shield his body with her own from the blast she knew was coming. The young lieutenant rode the larger soldier to the ground and tried to make them both as flat as possible. Kirsten Buckles squeezed her eyes shut and watched her life flash before her mind's eye. She waited for the blast that would shred her flesh and burn the uniform from her body. But it never came. Instead, the patch of dirt under the truck's tire merely went off with a light crackling sound. A small puff of smoke snaked its way out from underneath the tire. For all the world, that anticlimactic pop reminded Kirsten of the training IEDs used at NTC when they had been doing a foot patrol training module more than anything.
Holy crap, ma'am,
Jimenez said from underneath her.
I think you just saved me from a firecracker.
Buckles let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding in. She was vaguely amazed that she wasn't dead. She dropped her head and groaned, knowing that she was going to catch some playful ribbing from her platoon after that.
Well,
Buckles said in a voice that was laced with adrenaline-based tremors,
it was the thought that counted.
Jimenez laughed out loud at that. Buckles pushed herself to her knees and held out a hand for the buck sergeant. They pulled each other up.
Our first IED strike,
Jimenez said with a whistle as he examined the tire.
And it's a fucking dud.
Buckles nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that it might not have been. She couldn't have told you why, either. It was a feeling in her gut. She was just starting to remember her training. She and the platoon had more to do, after all. The IED was self-detonated, but she should be looking for an observer. She should be setting up security. She should be sending it up to higher. She had a long list of things she needed to attend to. Had she had more experience under her belt, she would have automatically turned to it, without having to remind herself. She turned to look back down the line of her convoy. Some of her soldiers were out of their trucks and moving towards her, having seen her dive on top of Jimenez. A Matvey was rolling up the line of trucks, which had to have been her platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Borowski, moving up to her position to see what the commotion was about. With Buckles paying attention to the rest of her platoon, she never noticed little wisps of greenish smoke start to rise up from the ground beneath the truck she was standing next to, looking not unlike freshly hatched juvenile snakes rising up from a clutch of eggs. Never noticed the way the wisps of greenish smoke seemed to move with a purpose towards the soldiers outside of the trucks. Never saw the wisp that singled her out, how it seemed to slither up her leg, up her back, toward the base of her skull. The wisp reared back like a rattlesnake and struck. It seemed to move right through the neck pad of her uck, like it was made out of mist. Buckles reached up to the back of her head, rubbing at the spot where she'd just been bitten. Jimenez mirrored her, but adding words.
Ow! What the fuck was that?
Buckles didn't respond. She turned and looked up at the line of trucks. The other soldiers who were on the deck all seemed to be rubbing at the back of their necks, or staring at their hand, looking for the mosquitoes they had just slapped. Buckles looked over at Jimenez.
Sergeant Jimenez?
She called to him, her voice an odd slur to it, making the young lieutenant sound like a stroke victim.
Are you okay?
Buckles found that she had a little trouble getting that question out. Her face started to feel numb. She tried to lift her arm up to rub her jaw, just to make sure her jaw was still there. But her limbs each felt like they weighed 1,000,000 pounds apiece. She managed to look down at her feet and found her equilibrium was starting to go. Buckles felt herself starting to sway, like she had just been put through a game of dizzy-wizzy. The ground all of a sudden looked like it was on a pendulum, or maybe her eyeballs were rolling around in her head. She couldn't be sure. The lieutenant tried to put her hands on her knees to steady herself, but her arms just wouldn't cooperate. They hung slack at her sides. She felt herself starting to tip forward. Through a momentum force of will, she managed to haul herself upwards out of the fall, more slinging her upper body upwards rather than anything else. She managed to get a look around. Her soldiers seemed to be in various states of distress around her. Jimenez was laying on his face next to the tire of the MRAP. Down the line, one of the soldiers was sitting propped up against the tire of a truck, rifle across her lap, head lolling to the side, fat strings of drool trailing out of the soldier's lips. Buckles managed to look the other way. She caught sight of another one of her soldiers leaning on the hood of a Humvee. He was barely standing, using the truck for support. He was vomiting down the chest of his body armor. He looked like the textbook definition of the word pathetic. Buckles suddenly felt sick herself. A lump was starting to rise in her gullet. It was the defac omelette she had for breakfast, deciding that now was the perfect time to make an escape attempt.
Oh God, she thought to herself. I'm about to puke in front of my Joes.
She managed to aim her face down and out, away from her gear. Partially digested egg yolk and diced up red peppers spewed from her lips, giving a charming visualization to the old phrase, Technicolor yawn. Cheese and stomach acid left one heck of an interesting flavor profile in Buckles' mouth. She looked down at the twice exposed to air food soaked in the dirty road, the chunks of chewed food making her want to puke again. The sunlight seemed to get 1,000 times brighter. Her vision started to blur and fade to white. She closed her eyes, trying to shield them from the sun's 1,000-megawatt smile. She felt herself start to lose her balance and begin tipping forward.
Don't land in the puke,
she mentally screamed at herself before she fell into her own sick. She landed face down with a bone-crunching crash, catching the full brunt of her body weight with the nose and lips. The coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. The impact forced a grunt out of her. Buckles tried not to think about the puke she was lying in.
Got to check on my Joes,
she managed to force out through bloodied lips, blood and snot spattering out of her smashed face as she spoke. She managed to force her arm up over her head that would do competent enough duty for a handhold. Her fingers found a tenuous grip on the running board of the truck she had been standing next to. She pulled on it, trying to pull her body weight up. The feeling of being on the verge of passing out was pushing her back down, but she fought against it. It took every bit of her not inconsiderable willpower to pull herself into a sitting position. She managed to turn her head and look around. She seemed to be the only soldier still in some form of consciousness. She noticed that a couple of the doors on the trunks were hanging open, soldiers splayed on the ground next to the vehicles, as if they were trying in vain to escape whatever was happening to the platoon, but hadn't gotten too far. One soldier was in his turret, head down on his vomit-spattered 50 cal, one hand draped over the edge of the gun's mount shield. Everyone was down. Everyone except for her. "Well, fiddlesticks," she whispered. Her head fell back against the truck. She tried to force herself to her feet. As the leader of the convoy, she had to figure out what happened. Was everyone about to die? Was her entire convoy dying around her? Had they been hit with a chemical weapon? Buckles began to panic. She tried to scream, not out of terror, but out of hope that she would get someone to move out of the danger area, that she would somehow rouse them. All she had managed to get out was a high-pitched gurgling croak that sent more bloody drool down the sides of her mouth. All of her soldiers were dying around her, and she couldn't even manage a scream. She closed her eyes. The idling diesel engines of her trucks were the only noise she could hear. Big American diesel engines that would idle into eternity on some crappy old road in a third-world backwater. Kirsten Buckles lost herself in the monotonous rumble. The engines seemed to grow louder until they drowned out all other stimuli. The noise felt warm to Buckles, like she could slip into it and ride the stream to a safer place. Why not do that? Buckles' eyes grew heavier, and she felt herself starting to slip away. Her body felt warm as she went under. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was screaming. "You fucking failure!" Lieutenant Kirsten Buckles mentally screamed at herself before she went under. When Kirsten's eyes opened again, she was honestly surprised. Surprised not only by the fact she was alive, but that she wasn't lying on a road outside of some village with an unpronounceable name on the other side of the world. No, she was in her room in her father's house. She bolted up out of bed and looked around. How long has she been out? Was she back stateside? How the heck did she get here? She looked down. She wasn't wearing her uniform or gear. She was wearing the University of Minnesota sweats that was her preferred sleeping attire. Goldie the gopher stared up at her from her shirt with a bucktooth smile. Buckles looked around the room in shock. What the heck was going on here? She should be dying with her soldiers on the other side of the world. Kirsten bolted out of her bathroom and towards the kitchen. The smell of coffee and bacon met her in the hallway, forcing her to stifle a dry heave-down. The smell of food was not her friend right now. Her stomach was still doing flip-flops from the roadside spew session. She burst into the kitchen that she had grown up in. Golden rays of morning sunshine spilled through the windows. Big Jim Buckles, Kirsten's father, was sitting at the table, a steaming mug of coffee sitting next to his morning paper, like he had been most every morning, as far back as Kirsten could remember. He looked up at her in surprise, but that warm smile of his soon spread across his features. "Kirsten," he said in a voice rich in fatherly affection, "you have to defend yourself." The phrase was out of place, but Kirsten barely noticed it. She ran over and wrapped her arms around him, realizing in that moment that for all the world she could really use a freaking hug. She pressed her face into his shoulder and felt the tears start to roll down her cheeks.
"Dad?"
She got out around the lump in her throat.
"How long have I been out? Am I Joe's making out? Is everyone okay?"
Big Jim didn't say anything at first, just returned his daughter's hug, rubbing the back of her head and patting her back. Kirsten let herself sink into the warm embrace for a moment, before realizing that she had to know what was going on. She pulled back from her father, wiping the tears away from her face.
"Dad?"
she said again.
"When did I get here?"
Big Jim Buckles motioned to the seat next to him, suggesting that Kirsten have a seat, which she took. Jim wordlessly rose from his seat and went to the kitchen counter. He poured a cup of coffee for Kirsten and brought it back to the table, setting it down in front of her. Kirsten looked down at the coffee cup and back up at her father.
Dad?
She started to question. Usually he was a boisterous, talkative kind of guy, and his uncharacteristic silence was starting to unnerve the young officer. Kirsten. He began his deep rumble of a voice. He normally spoke in a voice that was the definition of a command voice, and this morning was no different. You have to defend yourself. His face was deadly serious as he repeated that simple phrase.
Am I in trouble, Dad?
Kirsten asked in a meek tone of voice that she would have only been comfortable using around her father. The sort of voice that she wouldn't have been caught dead using around her soldiers. She hadn't done anything wrong back on that road. Were they looking to pin something on her? Kirsten felt like the bottom of the world had just fallen out. Her father hadn't said anything, but if she was in trouble, that meant some of her soldiers must have died, and she was being blamed for it.
Dad, what happened after I passed out?
Big Jim didn't say anything. He just shook his head. He reached down and picked up his mug. He looked down at her over the rim of his mug as he took a sip. Kirsten, you have to defend yourself.
Dad, I get that, but from what? Is someone coming after me? Am I being court-martialed?
Big Jim set his mug down on the table. He turned away from Kirsten with a bit of exasperation to his posture. He walked over to the kitchen countertop. He placed his hand on the formica, and Kirsten could see his shoulders slump and his head drop. Something was getting to her dad. Kirsten, he said again, and it sounded for all the world like he was saying the name through gritted teeth. You have to defend yourself.
Dad, I understand that,
Kirsten said, frustration gilding her tone.
You haven't told me what's going on, and for Pete's sake, would you stop repeating yourself?
Jim's head popped up at that. He spun around and glared at Kirsten. The only time she had ever seen her father's face look that angry was when she was 12, and she had accidentally burned down the chicken coop whilst playing with her dad's Zippo. Big Jim pushed off the counter and stomped across the kitchen. He reached out and grabbed the front of Kirsten's sweatshirt and jerked her to her feet. His face got within inches of hers. Kirsten, he said again, his voice a low growl. You have to defend yourself. Kirsten was now officially terrified.
Dad,
she squeaked out before trying to muster up something resembling a command voice.
You're scaring me. Let me go.
Kirsten noticed a dull roar starting to grow in the background. At first, she thought she was having a terror-induced audio hallucination, but she noticed something about the roar. It wasn't the sort of roar a lion would give out, to let the other lions know who was the boss on that particular savannah. This was more like the background roar of a city, a million different noises combined into a shapeless mass of rolling sound growing louder by the second. Her father leaned in closer, almost to the point where their noses were touching tips. If the situation weren't so freaking terrifying, Kirsten might have let out a chuckle. The background noise was still roaring and getting louder by the second. Kirsten, he said again, beginning his mantra once more, but having to use a louder tone of voice to project over the noise. You have to defend yourself! Kirsten felt the background roar roll into her. It felt like waves breaking around her. Her mouth fell open as all of the air in her lungs was forced out. The warm sunlight in the kitchen grew so bright it blurred out her vision. Her dad's angry face disappeared, consumed by light. Kirsten felt herself start to panic. She couldn't breathe. She felt the world spinning around her, like it was going down the drain, like the world was going to pin her under, like reality itself was going to suck her down into something else, and she had no choice but to let herself get pulled along again. Send. There was sand between the tips of her fingers. Very fine sand. She shifted her hand and felt the moon dust shift along ahead of her fingertips. The stench of half-digested defac omelette assaulted her nostrils, forcing her stomach to roll over and try to heave up the nothing it contained. A voice, guttural, unintelligible, speaking fast, excitedly, almost on the verge of yelling. Her eyes cracked open. The light of midday felt blinding. She moaned slightly. Kirsten could feel the tendrils of one doozy of a headache squeezing around her brain. She felt the kind of dazed you feel when you wake up from a 6-hour nap. The state of vaguely altered reality when your brain is rebooting. The sound of idling diesel engines came back to her. The road. She was on the road. She was the convoy commander. Her Joes. She had to check on her Joes. She turned her head towards the guttural speech, wondering if somebody was talking to her. There was a man in black robes screaming at the slumped-over form of Sergeant Jimenez. Kirsten watched the man. For a moment, as this was all she was about capable of doing. A knife flashed in the sunlight as the man held it above his head. With his other hand, he pointed accusatorily down at the knocked-out sergeant. Kirsten's heart pounded in her chest. One of her soldiers was about to die. She started moving her hand drunkenly towards the M9 pistol in her thigh rig. The man in black robes hawked a glob of spit and let it fly at Jimenez's face. The saliva splashed across Jimenez's cheek and hung there. The sight of it brought up Kirsten's bile again. The man seemed to be really mad at Jimenez. He hooked up another loogie. But before he let fly with another biological artillery, Kirsten spoke up. "Hey," she said with about all the effort she could muster. "Stop that." The man paused just as he was about to spit. His whole body froze like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar when he realized the young officer was awake. His face swung towards Kirsten, just as she managed to get her hands around the pistol's grip. The thing that stuck out to Kirsten was the man's eyes were pitch black. Not the pupil, but the whole eye. Just straight up darkness. Kirsten thumbed the pistol's safety off as the man turned his whole body toward her. The knife in his hand turned her way, and she had an idea of what he might have intended to do with it. The man took a step her way. His robes fell open, and she couldn't help but notice that his feet were hooves, not shoes, which was odd, but not Kirsten's biggest issue at the moment. The knife flashed her way, and the man started screaming at her. She brought up her pistol cowboy style with one hand, which was fairly impressive, since it felt like it weighed about a gazillion pounds in her altered state. She pulled the trigger. The pistol barked in her hand. The man stopped yelling at her. He looked down at his chest. He looked back at Kirsten. He made a huffing chuff of a sound. He took another step forward, a little unsteady. Kirsten noticed that drops of blood were now hitting the sand around the man's hooves. Little drops of dark red making brownish mud in the sandy road. The man let out a guttural sound and kept moving forward. The knife flashed above his head before he brought it down towards Kirsten's face. Her empty hand shot up in defense. The blade landed right between her middle finger and her ring finger, and kept pushing down. Kirsten knew she would be in a lot of pain, but she was just too tired to feel it. It felt more odd than anything. She could feel her hand coming apart like a zipper as the blade shredded the meat between her finger bones. Kirsten was going to have to do something about that, or this man was going to start cutting chunks out of the young officer. She jammed the pistol up into the man's bearded chin and pulled the trigger until the side locked back. The man had had a face once. Just recently, in fact. Heck, he had had a whole darn head once. Now it was just split open meat and blood. The body of the black-eyed man with hooves fell across Kirsten Buckles. The weight of the man, now uncontrolled, drove the blade deeper into her hand, finally coming to a rest to the bone of her wrist. Kirsten could hear the blood hammering in her veins, well after 6 blasts from her handgun, especially that close to her head. That was all she would be able to hear for a while. Next time she killed a black-eyed man with hooves, she was going to have to remember ear protection. She went to shove the corpse off of her, but realized she just didn't have the strength to do it. He was just going to have to stay there for now. She looked around. She felt a genuine burst of joy when she looked over at Jimenez. His eyes were open. He was lying on his back, staring over at her. He had a hand raised, like he was reaching for her. His mouth was moving like he was calling. Kirsten couldn't hear him, but that didn't matter. He was alive. She hadn't failed him. Hopefully more would be alive also. Gosh darn it, if he was alive, more were alive. She wasn't a total failure. She let out the breath she had been holding in and promptly passed out. When the young officer had awoken again, she was in a hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany. As soon as she could form a coherent sentence, the first thing she asked about were her soldiers. The fact that there were fingers missing from her left hand was a trivial matter in those few moments. She wanted to know how her Joes were. She wanted to know how bad she'd messed up. None of the staff in the hospital knew, of course. They were happy to point out that the only person from her unit in that particular hospital was herself. For 18 hours, she had lived in a hell of self-induced anxiety. She figured somebody would have had something for her, but no. All she got was sympathetic nods, frowns, and hand squeezes. She couldn't help but feel there was something they were hiding from her. This was confirmed by a nurse who was checking on her.
"Girl, I don't know what's going on here,"
she whispered as she leaned over Kirsten, checking her vitals.
"But there are guys from the DOD here. Black suits and sunglasses. They're asking about you every hour. They told us not to ask you anything about how you got here. Any communication about you or your condition needs to be routed through them. They told us that your care needs to take priority over everyone else's." "The heck it does,"
Kirsten in whisper shouted back, outrage shaking her voice.
"I'm fine. You tell those blockheads that the freaking Joes come first." "Girl, who are you telling?"
the nurse responded.
"I've got a Marine Lance Corporal 2 doors down with shrapnel from an RPG-7 still in his neck." "And that Lance Corporal better take priority over me,"
Kirsten said in her best command voice.
"And that's a freaking order, Doc."
"I outrank you, Lieutenant," the nurse said with a warm smile. Kirsten's eyes flickered over to the nurse's badge, which read, Captain Lucia Markham, Critical Care Services.
"But I have to say, I love the attitude."
It'd be another 4 hours before Kirsten got her first visitor. A well-built man, somewhere between his late 30s and early 40s, stood in her doorway. He had a thick folder under his arm and both hands shoved into his pockets. Kirsten stared at him without saying anything. This had to have been one of the feds who was telling people that she mattered more than anyone else. She narrowed her eyes at him. She wanted to give him such a piece of her mind, but to just start ripping into him would have been very unprofessional on her part. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with a warm smile. "My name's Tom. I was wondering if you had a moment to discuss your next duty assignment."